At the beginning of the film, we observe a writer being interviewed and discussing whether to write only about her experiences. At the same time, Sandra's blind son decides to wash their dog, Snoop. The writer's husband, Samuel, turns up the music loudly, which interferes with the conversation. Sandra nervously sips from her glass and tries to find a new topic of dialogue. For some unknown reason, the writer is burdened by the discussing truth and fiction in her books and wants to just have a heart-to-heart talk. The music in the attic gets louder and louder. However, Sandra is not in a hurry to reprimand her husband. At first, the woman continues to answer questions amidst the eerie noise, and then offers to reschedule the interview for another day. Daniel walks with Snoop on snowy trails and soon returns home. The boy discovers his father Samuel, who seems to have fallen from the attic and lost his own life from it. The writer runs out of the house and comforts Daniel. A crying Sandra calls an ambulance. The woman gives a statement, after which the remains of her husband are taken away for examination. The doctors discover that the severe head injury that took Samuel's life had occurred before the fall. For this reason, Sandra is questioned twice, first by a policeman and then by an investigator. The writer decides to ask her friend Vincent for help. The lawyer asks Sandra to repeat as accurately as possible what she has already told during the interrogation. Their dialogue is heard by Daniel, who lies sadly in his room. According to the writer, Samuel worked in the attic in the morning and listened to music, because of which the interview broke down. Sandra decided to sleep with earplugs. However, an hour later, she woke up to the screams of her son. The lawyer examines the house and asks questions about what happened. It turns out that Samuel had always been careful in his work and didn't drink. With these facts, his fall from the window seems a rather strange event. The next day, Sandra tries to get her son out of bed, but the boy cries most of the time and says he doesn't feel like doing anything. The mother tries to support her son and says that despite the loss, they should try to live life as normal. Sandra herself feels tired of crying already, but realizes that healing takes time. At breakfast, Vincent tells her that the autopsy was unable to determine what caused Samuel to pass away. The lawyer tries to build a line of defense, because he is going to make a version that the man fell from the roof and hit his head on a small outbuilding, and then crawled a couple of meters, which explains the marks in the snow. Also, Vincent is confused by the bruise on the writer's arm. Sandra reveals that it remains on her from the kitchen table, which she sometimes walks past not very carefully. Vincent believes her. However, he says that they have another problem. The investigation probably won't believe it was an accidental fall, because the lawyer himself doesn't believe it either. Vincent thinks that Sandra's husband might have decided to do something terrible and take his own life. The writer is horrified, because how could he do such a thing right in front of his son? Vincent realizes that this sounds somewhat absurd. However, they have no other versions. As the lawyer leaves, Sandra remembers one detail. About 6 months ago, she found Samuel on the bathroom floor unconscious. Sandra guessed from some signs that her husband had taken a lot of pills. In the evening, the writer revisits the video of her husband. The next day, the investigation decides to summon Daniel for questioning. The boy claims that he didn't hear his parents quarreling, especially on the day of the tragedy. However, when Daniel went out for a walk with his dog, he could hear his parents' voices, but they were definitely not quarreling. The investigation decides to conduct an experiment to find out how loud Samuel and his wife were talking. During the test, it turns out that Daniel had mistaken the place from which he had heard his parents' voices. In the evening, Sandra plays the piano with her son and then asks him not to worry about the interrogations. The next day, Vincent is interviewed outside the courtroom. It turns out that the writer has been detained because of some recording that could harm her. The next day, the prosecutor presses charges against Sandra. It turns out that the splashes on the walls, as well as the strange evidence of Daniel and the recording of a conversation between the couple the day before the tragedy, give rise to speculation about whether Sandra didn't take her husband's life. During the first court hearing, the prosecutor demands that the writer be taken into custody. Otherwise, she can put pressure on the key witness, her son. However, the lawyers manage to convince the judge that Sandra needs to take care of her son, because during an accident at the age of 4, the boy lost his sight. The court allows the writer to stay with her son for the duration of the trial. Vincent takes Sandra home and asks why the lady kept from him a major quarrel she had with her husband the day before the tragedy. The writer is desperate. She realizes that people don't care about the truth and won't consider the fact that quarrels are a normal part of life. At home, Sandra faces another problem. Now Marsh will often spend time with Daniel. The court representative has to make sure that the boy is not pressurized by his mother during the trial. Daniel immediately says that he won't be friends with Marsh, but promises that he will tell her if anything in his mother's behavior seems strange to him. The next day, the lawyers ask the writer to record some videos for the court. On them, Sandra has to present the nature of her relationship with her husband. The writer also mentions how her son lost his sight. Samuel, like her, was a writer, but it was a difficult occupation for him. One day, inspiration struck, and he decided to ask the nanny to pick up the boy from daycare, even though he had to do it himself. In the end, the babysitter was late, and Daniel was hit by a motorbike, causing the boy loses his sight. After this tragedy, Samuel blamed himself very much for what had happened. Sandra realizes that she will have to tell a lot of things about her husband, even though it will upset her son. A year passes. At the next court hearing, the girl who interviewed Sandra on the day of the tragedy speaks. Her evidence is used by the prosecutor to make it appear that the writer was already preparing to attack her husband and was therefore distracted. In addition, the prosecution believes that Sandra tried to please her guest and created an overly pleasant atmosphere. The prosecutor also believes that the writer realized that Samuel had put the music on loudly, precisely to disrupt the interview. Next, the judge considers 2 hypotheses about the appearance of red drips on the outhouse. According to the prosecution's version, such marks could have occurred if Samuel had been hit on the head and pushed down from the 3rd floor. The defense, on the other hand, provides alternative evidence of the possibility of the drops being caused by a fall from the attic and hitting his head on the extension. The next day, Daniel is going to be removed from the trial because what he might learn there could shock him. However, the boy insists that he needs to know the whole truth. The next day at the trial, the question is settled. Could Samuel have taken his own life? The man's psychiatrist insists that there was no objective reason for this. In addition, the doctor believes that Sandra pressurized her spouse with feelings of guilt for the situation that happened to their son. From the excitement, the writer switches to another language and tries to explain that she tried to support Samuel and keep their relationship, whatever happened. In the evening, Sandra spends time with her lawyer, who turns out to have been in love with her for a long time. Vincent swears that he believes the writer and realizes that she is innocent. Before going to bed, Sandra talks to her son. The writer tries to explain to Daniel that in court, all the facts are presented only to accuse or justify, but not to understand the complexity of human relationships. At the next court session, the jury listens to a recording of a violent argument that took place the day before the tragedy. It turns out that Samuel is unhappy that he is forced to spend all his time on anything but himself. The man also brings up Sandra's infidelity and the idea for her book that was stolen from him. Eventually, the scandal escalates into a scuffle. The prosecutor persistently builds up the prosecution's case. He is convinced that it was Sandra who took her husband's life. Vincent tries to justify the writer, explaining that Samuel has had a very difficult year. Vincent is convinced that Sandra has succeeded in doing what her spouse has failed to do, and this has broken him. That is why Samuel decided to take his own life. However, Vincent's arguments seem less convincing. Besides, the prosecutor mentions that Sandra was shifting the blame to her husband. Samuel fought furiously, judging from the last argument. So why would he take his own life? The prosecution line also mentions that the writer is on record as having raised her hand to her husband, which makes one wonder if she did it afterwards as well, but more violently. After hearing the arguments, the judge announces that Daniel will be the main witness at the next hearing. He will have to confirm or deny his father's decadent moods before his death. It is Daniel's words that will ultimately determine the fate of his mother. The judge also mentions that the boy has new information, so she asks Sandra not to discuss the trial with her son. In the evening, Daniel chats with Marsh and says that the time before the trial he would like to spend without his mother. Sandra tries to change the boy's mind, but in response he just keeps silent. The writer leaves home with Vincent, unable to hold back her tears because of what has happened. Meanwhile, Daniel decides to check his mother's words about his father's poisoning. The boy feeds his dog aspirin and discovers the next day that he is barely breathing. Daniel calls Marsh and asks her to help bring Snoop to his senses. In the kitchen, the boy tearfully tells her that a few months ago, the dog was acting just as strangely and smelling of vomit. Now, having done this experiment, Daniel realizes that his mother's words about her father poisoning himself with pills may be true if Snoop was poisoned that day by accident while licking his father. During the walk, Marsh advises the boy to choose which side he is on. Daniel spends the whole evening thinking about it. Finally, the day of the meeting arrives. Daniel recalls talking to his father after he tried to take his own life, according to his mother. The boy says that Samuel then compared himself to Snoop, who has to do a lot of things, and said that one day he would want to leave. The court decides to acquit Sandra, and she returns home. After kissing her son before going to bed, the writer lies down next to Snoop and falls asleep. This is the end of the film. Thank you all for watching this video to the end. Give this video a like, write in the comments what you think about this film, and see you in new videos.